All right, let's dive in. Today we're looking at Peter Kürten, a name often, well, overshadowed by that sensational media nickname, the Vampire of Düsseldorf.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we really want to move past just, listing the horrific acts. The
hmm
material we have lets us explore the man, the era he lived in, which is crucial, and the impact his case had later on.
Yeah, the sources are quite varied. We've got insights into the historical context, Weimar Germany, Kürten's own statements, which we definitely need to talk about the reliability there.
Oh, absolutely. Huge caveats.
Right, and then there's the analysis from people at the time trying to figure him out, plus how the whole thing sort of rippled outwards.
And you'll see how all these different threads kind of weave together. It's not just about one disturbed individual, but how so many factors intersect in a case like this.
Okay, so setting the stage. To really get Peter Kürten, we have to understand the world around him, right? Weimar Germany sounds like a mess.
It really was. The sources paint a picture of Germany in the 1920s, right after World War I,
Yeah.
as incredibly unstable. You had, profound economic hardship, hyperinflation, people losing everything, massive unemployment.
Wow.
And alongside that, this sense of political turmoil, social rules kind of fraying at the edges.
Mm.
It was a society under enormous pressure.
So, a background of widespread anxiety, maybe desperation. How did the sources suggest that might connect to Kürten's crimes? Did it make things easier for him somehow?
Well, the thinking of the sources goes a couple of ways. One idea is that this instability could have created more potential victims, people who were more vulnerable, maybe forced into riskier situations just to survive.
Okay, that makes sense.
And there's also the suggestion that with society and the police dealing with so much general chaos, maybe someone like Kürten could operate, under the radar for longer, at least initially. Less focused scrutiny, perhaps.
So, the public fear, once things started coming out, and the police response, they were also affected by this general climate of instability.
Definitely. The sources suggest the existing anxiety absolutely fueled the public panic, and the police face huge challenges, maybe magnified by the strain on resources and just, the general disorder.
Mm.
The material even touches on the cultural mood. It was this weird mix of artistic freedom, sort of decadent experimentation, but also this undercurrent of real tension and despair.
Yeah.
And the sources kind of pose the question, how did Kürten's extreme violence fit into that?
Right.
Was it a bizarre reflection of the underlying darkness or just a complete horrifying contrast?
So, moving from that wider picture to Kürten himself. A huge part of trying to understand him comes from his own words, right? His confessions after he was caught. The sources say they were
Oh,
extensive.
incredibly extensive,
Mm.
really detailed. And the sources are clear. These confessions are vital for analysis. But, and this is a big but, you absolutely have to question their reliability. This is where it gets really tricky.
Tricky because, well, first off, why confess so much? What were the theories the sources mentioned? Narcissism?
That's definitely one strong possibility mentioned. Extreme narcissism, wanting to boast, maybe reliving the crimes, gave him some kind of perverse satisfaction. Or even this twisted desire to finally be, known or understood, however warped that sounds.
But the crucial point, the one the sources hammered home, was that this wasn't someone genuinely seeking forgiveness. He was described as a lifelong criminal.
And likely, he's a psychopathic liar.
Yeah. So the huge question is, how much of what he said can you actually believe? Did he embellish things, leave things out, twist the narrative to fit how he wanted to be seen, even at the end?
Exactly. That's the fundamental problem. Was he constructing a persona? And you also have to consider, like the sources suggest, who was asking the questions. The police, the psychiatrists. Could their approach have shaped his answers?
Right. Could they have inadvertently led him?
It's a definite possibility raised in the material. So we're left with this incredibly detailed account, potentially offering glimpses into his motives, the sadism, the fascination with blood, even the arson he committed. But it's filtered through this lens of manipulation and potential fabrication.
Did the sources get into connecting those things,
Yeah.
the sadism, the paraphilias, to his background, like potential childhood trauma shaping these fantasies?
They do, especially when discussing the work of people like Professor Carl Berg. The sources indicate Berg explored Kürten's development, Right. suggesting that, early life experiences likely played a role in the escalation of his violent fantasies and specific paraphilias.
But tying it definitively based only on Kürten's own possibly unreliable testimony, that's the challenge.
Precisely. It was a key area for contemporary analysis, but inherently difficult given the source.
Okay, so let's talk about Professor Karlberg. The sources mention him quite a bit as someone trying to make sense of Kürten at the time.
Yes, Carl Berg was a psychiatrist who got significant access to Kürten after his arrest. He interviewed him extensively.
And wrote a book.
He did. Der Sadist, der Fall Peter Kürten. The Sadist, the case of Peter Kürten. It became a really important, almost foundational text in trying to understand this kind of offender, certainly at that time.
What were Berg's main conclusions, according to the sources we looked at?
Well, Berg provided some of the first really detailed psychiatric assessments of Kürten's psychopathology. The nature of his mental state, how it might have developed over his life. He was trying to understand the motivations, often working directly from those very confessions we just discussed, with all their complexities.
So a pioneering effort, really, trying to apply psychiatric ideas to such an extreme case.
Absolutely. And his work, as the sources note, definitely influenced how forensic psychology approached similar cases later on.
Okay, let's shift perspective a bit. What about the actual investigation? The police work on the ground in Düsseldorf and the public reaction.
The police were, frankly, facing an uphill battle. The sources highlight how varied Kürten's attacks were. Different victims, men, women, children, different methods, from stabbings to strangulation, even arson early on.
So it wasn't immediately obvious it was one person?
Not at all. That variation made it incredibly difficult for investigators initially to even connect the crimes, to realize they were hunting a single serial offender.
And while they were struggling with that, what was life like in the city? The sources mentioned panic.
Immense panic, yeah. The sources described Düsseldorf during that period as being gripped by real terror. Daily life was disrupted. People were afraid to be out, especially after dark. It sounds like a city under siege.
And the newspapers? Fueling it, reflecting it.
Probably both, as often happens. They reported on the growing fear, but the coverage, especially as it became more sensational, likely amplified the panic too.
Which is where the famous nickname comes in, the vampire.
That's it, the vampire of Düsseldorf. The sources point out this was largely a media label, linked to certain specific grisly details of some crimes. While it certainly captured the horror, it also, perhaps, contributed to this almost mythical status around Kürten.
Maybe overshadowing the real victims and the tough police work?
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
It created this larger-than-life monster image, which the sources suggest became part of his enduring dark legend.
But in the middle of all that fear and the struggling investigation, there was one individual who, according to the sources, played an absolutely vital role in stopping him: his wife.
Augusta Kürten, or Frau Kürten. Yes, her role was critical and just incredibly difficult to imagine. The sources explain that Peter Kürten actually confided in her, told her details about his crimes.
He told his wife. Wow. And she
eventually put the pieces together. Apparently, when the police released a composite sketch later in the investigation, she recognized him.
Oh my God, what must that have been like for her?
Unimaginable. The sources touch on the psychological weight living with him, the fear, realizing who she was married to, and then making that decision. The incredibly brave, agonizing decision to go to the authorities. Her testimony was absolutely key to his capture.
So let's move towards the end of the case itself and then its legacy. What happened legally?
Well, the sources mentioned the trial. His confessions, despite the reliability questions we talked about, were central evidence. And given the sheer number and brutality of the crimes he was convicted of, the outcome was, well, almost inevitable at the time.
The death penalty.
Yes, he was executed by guillotine. The sources note that this aligned with the prevailing views on capital punishment for such crimes in Germany back then.
And beyond the trial and sentence, what about the long-term impact? You mentioned his case influenced certain fields.
Hugely. This is really where the sources emphasize its lasting significance. Kürten's case, especially because of those detailed confessions, and Professor Berg's attempts to analyze them psychiatrically, became incredibly influential in criminology and the developing field of forensic psychology.
How so? What did it change or inform?
It provided one of the most extensive case studies available at the time for trying to understand the psychology of serial offenders, particularly those driven by sexual sadism. It highlighted just how complex these individuals could be.
So it helped shape the questions researchers started asking.
Exactly. It laid some groundwork for future research into psychopathology, criminal motivation, the nature of sadism. It really forced people to confront the complexities involved in understanding such extreme violence. The sources make it clear it had a significant long-term impact.
This whole deep dive really underscores that trying to understand a case like Peter Kürten's, it's just not straightforward, is it? It's so much more than just the crimes.
Absolutely. It's like putting together a really complex puzzle. You need to look at the individual, their history, their psychology, as murky as that might be. You need the details of the crime, sure, but then you need that broader context, the society they lived in. And then you need the layers of analysis, both contemporary, like Berg's work, and how understanding evolved later. It's all interconnected.
And thinking about it like that really brings it back to you, listening. It shows how these deeply disturbing events aren't isolated. They emerge from this complex mix of individual and societal factors, things you might not immediately connect.
Which loops us back, I think, to that central challenge we kept bumping up against, the one the sources really emphasize regarding his confessions.
Reliability problem, yeah.
Exactly. If the sources tell us he was almost certainly a pathological liar, a manipulator, or someone crafting a narrative, how much can we ever truly rely on what someone like that says about themselves, even when they're giving extensive details? Especially when we're trying to get at the deepest why. Why did he do it?
It's a really unsettling question, isn't it? It makes you think about the inherent limits of trying to understand the darkest parts of human behavior and the incredible difficulties faced by those who study these cases, relying on often flawed or deceptive information from the source itself. Leaves you wondering.